Yeah.
Nice to be back.
Kristo. And the efforts that Estonia has pioneered in terms of a decentralized approach to its citizenry, how they are connected, what the government is doing to empower the people who live in Estonia. And Kristo, I think just to kind of kick things off, would be interesting to hear some of your background. You're an engineer, and now you're working in the public sector, but you started out in the private sector. So just give folks a sense of kind of your own journey in this, and then we can get into what Estonia is doing these days.
Yes, I've loved technology ever since I first laid my hands on it. I have been working as an engineer for the better part of my life, and then in the last few years I realized that maybe I should do something for the public sector as well. And since Estonia is such a small country, for us having this kind of pride to sort of give back to your country has been such a driving force for me. And now my main thing why I'm actually working for the government is to make sure that the projects, once we actually start getting on with them, that they would not fail before the first line of code is written, or the first blockchain, so to speak, so that we would have the things in place so that we can actually take advantage of the technology that is provided.
And pronounce your last name for everyone, by the way. So
oh, yes. My last name is spelled as Vaher. It means maple in English, but I'm not Canadian.
Yeah, well, I'm from Canada originally, so I appreciate that. And the population of Estonia, about 1.3 million, and went through a tumultuous time during the separation from the Soviet Union, as people knew it then, and establishing its own independence, and this is back in the 1990s. And so, in a sense, Estonia had an opportunity to restart, thinking about its identity and how technology could fit into that. Was that sort of the genesis of how this all came about? Because these days people connect blockchain with Estonia in this kind of natural way and talk about the origins of Bitcoin and so on, but really it predates a lot of the hype around it.
I think you're pretty correct here. In the 90s, we ended up in a situation which was discussed here a few talks ago about the blockchain and policy. We ended up in a situation where we had no policies, no regulations other than what we grandfathered from Soviet era as well as from earlier Estonian times. So we ended up in a situation where there were no regulations and there was no policy set in stone. But technology was still advancing. So the idea there was that we started using technology before we regulated it. And I think this is the sort of like golden zone or really nirvana there, because you need to be able to try out what this technology actually means before you go too much and too hard into regulating it. In this day and age, we are in a situation where, because we are in European Union and we have so many regulations from European side as well as in Estonia in place, we are in a situation where it's much more difficult, just like in the policy hard talk was discussed here a few talks ago, where it's really difficult to sort of innovate. Because one of the classic quotes is that if you regulate and create laws before you innovate, you will never ever innovate. You end up in a situation where you essentially redo the same thing over and over again with just different restrictions. And I think the blockchain has opened another new door to us that everybody is exploring, and no one really yet knows how to properly regulate yet. And this is an opportunity not just for Estonia, but also for other countries in the world, including UAE. And I think that this opportunity should really be grabbed onto, because if we are able to create a lot of interesting technology and solutions for our citizens and residents in that time before we entirely regulate everything, then we can make the next generation leap.
And now that you've had time in the private sector and the public sector, you mentioned that earlier discussion on hard talk with policy. What is that relationship like between policymakers and the private sector within Estonia today, and what could folks here in the region learn?
I think we are struggling in the same way as many other European countries are struggling. I think that UAE has such an opportunity at the moment because you have an immense amount of resources and a lot of this are invested into attracting a lot of international attention, and this is very important because this can bring in talent and this can bring in new solutions. In terms of Estonia, what we are trying to figure out is if we are able to recreate or reinvigorate this kind of Wild West kind of zone for certain technologies and certain sort of problem solving, so that we can try out new things without being held back too much by regulations. But we haven't cracked that nut yet. We hope that we will at some point, because we really do believe that we first need to sort of figure out how we're going to use something or what are the proper tools for it, and then we'll see how we need to regulate it, not the other way around.
Give some folks some pragmatic or specific examples of how blockchain or decentralization affects the citizenry of Estonia. I understand that there's e-voting, for example, but just what are some of the ways that people are really gravitating to this as a
I will correct you for a second there. E-voting is technically a wrong term. We call it I-voting because e-voting is already an international thing about all of these voting booths and machines. They're called like for e-voting. This is why we use internationally the term I-voting as in internet voting, so people can vote digitally. We actually had elections very recently, and 44% of all the votes were digital, which means, well, which was absolutely huge. Next time we hope that this would be way above 50%. And this is, it's going to break the sort of the backbone of digitalization in terms of getting us forward. But we are not directly using blockchain in our internet voting. We are using blockchain in a very different way. Because of GDPR, as in global general data regulations in Europe, we have a lot of issues regarding privacy and what your data is, and all the institutions in our government are also very strongly tied to what data they have. So we cannot put data directly into blockchain. This is not how we use blockchain. But what we use blockchain for is to store fingerprints of data, which means that if you have something that belongs to you, you can always compare this against your fingerprint that is in blockchain and know that nothing has happened to this data. This was absolutely crucial for us after 2007 in a wide variety of cyber attacks, where we ended up in a situation where our government, as well as our citizen, wasn't exactly sure what kind of data had been tampered with due to the hacks. And that's a scary thing. You can imagine your own home right now, and imagine that someone who shouldn't be there is at your home, moving something, removing something, taking something away, or placing something new there, and you have no idea. This is where we were at in 2007, and we needed to fix this. And so blockchain, despite it not being hyped as a blockchain at that time, was used to solve this problem, so that we would have this immutable ledger of information that we could always compare against to make sure that, yes, this data is exactly as we know how we stored it. And I think this was really revolutionary for us. And we have relied on this kind of technology ever since. One of the companies that is doing a lot of international work as well, called Guardtime, is actually dealing with this and providing these services for Estonian government. And they were born with the cooperation of Estonian government.
What's the reaction been of the Estonian people, just in terms of trust and acceptance and embracing this idea of innovation within a relatively small country? Do people feel a sense of pride in being labeled as a more cutting-edge democracy? Are they keen to see this grow, or have they pushed back in any way?
I think this is a good question. In many ways, I grew up as one of the kids during the Tiger Leap, which happened in the 90s. I was born in the 80s, but when I went to school, it was in the 90s. And Estonia, what we did was we invested a lot into our education and made sure that our kids, the small scoundrels, instead of running around on the streets, were sitting behind computers and trying out this new fancy thing. I was one of those kids back then, and now I'm here. And I think that this is ingrained into current generation of Estonians, and this we cannot really lose that. I think that this is now something that is something that is part of Estonians, and I think that this shift has happened to us a generation maybe earlier than in some other countries, but I think that other countries are going to make a step back, because there's no kid today that doesn't use digital devices. But getting them to develop code is a whole different matter, of course. I think that education should still be education should still strongly focus on making sure that this happens, so that you actually have people building your blockchain and building your algorithms and building your smart contracts. And I think this is important. But regarding transparency in Estonia, and regarding technology, is that Estonians take technology really for granted. We cannot imagine it in a different way. People that have moved from Estonia to another country have immediately complained to their friends as a first thing that this is a problem for them, that they cannot do their paperwork digitally, that they cannot get their job permit, that they cannot even get an apartment without having to do massive amount of paperwork. And this is not a problem in Estonia. But, well, usually if you go to another country, you talk about or complain about other things that are off in your home, but in Estonians, they compare that, it's not digital enough, it's not problematic enough. And I think that a great example here is that we had a security problem with our identity card last year, and it was a really big thing. It was an international thing. We had problems with the company and supplier, and we had problems with the algorithm. We couldn't prove that it could be hacked, but it was hypothetically possible. So we had to patch it. And everybody was at first internationally like, oh, Estonia is making a problem or a mistake there. But what happened really was that Estonians took it like, well, it happens. Sometimes there are problems or bugs in software. And what actually happened is that there was no decrease in use of digital software, your identity card, your digital identity, none at all. And in some areas it even increased. So this is like sort of, it's so ingrained to us that it's not something that is foreign for us. I guess it is part of us, and I think that as long as we can make sure that we don't lose that, then I think that many great other things we can also talk about in years to come regarding Estonia.
I like to say technology is wonderful when it works.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So this being the Future Blockchain Summit, how are you as the CTO of Estonia thinking about the future of blockchain, and what are some of the use cases that you can point to?
I think some of previous speakers here have also mentioned some very hard truths. Is the blockchain is technically a tool, and this is like regarding driving Estonian technological vision and driving like how we should build software, how we should actually approach problem solving, is that we consider it as one of the tools because it happened to us as one of the tools, and this is the same with a lot of other things. The great thing about blockchain is that it's a really new, unique kind of tool that again hasn't been regulated way too much yet. So it can solve problems that maybe we cannot even detect yet, but we cannot approach it from the technology vector. We have to always approach whatever we are trying to use blockchain for from the problem. Is blockchain the right tool to solve a specific problem? Many examples in this conference have been brought up where blockchain seems like an absolutely great tool, and I think that focus exactly should be on that. It's not about us just using blockchain, it's us using blockchain for the right things. You want to use a hammer for a nail, you don't want to use scissors for your nail, even though scissors are a much fancier tool and solves a lot of other issues as well. So I think that this is a really important part, and this is what me and my team, we are doing in Estonia regularly. Is that we are exploring these options. We are trying to make sure that we try out new tools and new technologies in a small scale so that we can see if the tool might be a good solution for a specific problem. If it isn't, then the small scale problem, we can just lay it aside and use some other tool to solve it. And this is essentially how we are dealing with blockchain. It's one of the fancy new tools in the toolbox.
Is that advice you would give to folks here in Dubai, the city of the future being an example? Is there a tendency for people to think a little too big at the beginning when applying decentralized tools?
I think that we are right now, we're at the point where the thought about blockchain is that it's becoming really close to the place like, what next? Like where's the specific revolution happening, or where's this specific disruption happening? It's that because we're focusing too much, I guess, on the tool itself. But I think, in retrospect, that blockchain as such, at the moment, the way how Dubai is handling it and how UAE is handling it is absolutely wonderful because, again, drawing back to my earlier point, is that it isn't regulated enough. It is something that is new and exciting, and the tools that are created in UAE here could easily scale outwards internationally into other countries. just like I guess that how Estonian company Guardtime managed to like expand their business internationally, offering their fingerprinting essentially worldwide. And I think that this is the opportunity here. It's the attraction of blockchain that brings smart people like all of you here together to discuss the prospects of how we could use the tool, not what the tool itself exactly is.